I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. We've got a happy one today, don't we, Rob?
It's a real upper. I think when if you read this on a dark, stormy day when everything's going wrong, it's really going to pick you up. This story has everything, Lee. It's got Japanese invaders. It's got
communists,
sexual assault.
Yeah.
It's got loneliness. It's got it all. It's basically a Joy Division song, but in China.
Today we are looking at Dingling's When I Was in Xia Village.
And we've done another podcast on Dingling.
That was her early work, her
Miss
May
Sophie's
4th
Diary.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's from the May 4th period. It's a kind of like just a attempt to look into a Chinese woman's mind during this period. And it's fascinating, but I think the story, it's so much better.
What makes Dingling such an interesting writer, and to some extent the best writers of this early part of the 20th century in China are all this way, it's the stuff she's not telling you.
Yeah.
That is so interesting.
It's the Hemingway iceberg theory of literature
Yeah.
that Dingling is really doing a great job with.
Yeah, and in this story, she is writing in the first person. Again, we can't say this is Dingling's experience because
I tell this to my students all the time. The narrator is not the author.
Yes.
The narrator is not the author.
Right. And, I mean, it could be, probably is based on a lot of personal experiences, but we don't know to what extent, which is part of the fun.
Can you give us a little outline of the story?
So, in this story, the narrator begins by essentially saying she's kind of gotten burned out, and the party recommends that she go to Xia Village, which is in the Yan'an region anyway. We have a different podcast on Mao's talks at Yan'an, which is in sort of slightly northwest central China.
North of Xi'an and
Yeah.
the Terracotta Warriors.
Yeah. It's a part of the country where people traditionally lived in caves. Now, that sounds really negative, but if you have a lot of very sturdy hillsides like that, it's a pretty ideal way to live. You can't get sturdier. Always stays cool in the summer, warm in the winter. It's a pretty good way to live. Anyway, she goes to this village, is accompanied by someone else who's supposed to be doing some work there. And when they get there, they hear some commotion, and it turns out that a young woman has just returned to the village after having been essentially basically a sex slave.
She was raped by the
repeatedly
Japanese.
by the Japanese, right. This is at a period of time when the Japanese are really pushing their way into China, all over China.
And at some point she was married to a Japanese
Right.
officer or something. She
Yeah.
was working also as a spy for the Communist Party.
Right. So she comes back, and the narrator strikes up a friendship with her. For my money, the most interesting part of the story is the amount of time that goes by in the story with us not knowing anything. They talk about just stuff. The girl whose name is Zheng,
Which translates to purity.
she doesn't tell much. She doesn't just wring her hands and weep and wail. She sort of just talks about everything very matter-of-factly.
If I could say, many rape victims.
Could be. There's no real need to
Or there's
go
no
into
real
it.
ability.
Yeah. And so she never does. We just know that she was in this terrible situation. In fact, it's very striking to read the way she talks about it and go, yikes, that's really just sort of, yeah, this happened. Anyway, moving on. And at the end of the story, she has a sexually transmitted disease. I'm not sure exactly which one.
I don't actually know that it's clear that it's a real disease.
I don't think for the narrator
Yeah.
it's even that important. But anyway, at the end of the story, a young man in a nearby area who has been in love with her for years but never really pursued her because he was very, very, very poor and he knew her parents would reject him, is still proposing marriage to her now, and she's turned him down.
And it's not clear that they can actually get married.
Right. And she decides to leave and go to Yan'an to get treatment for her disease and also to basically learn from the communists who've set up shop there. It's better to be sort of uncomfortable in a group of strangers and maybe do something new than stuck here where everyone judges you all the time.
Now, this is the question that I struggle with my students, and I have a definite opinion on this, but there are two bad guys in this story, really. The Japanese who did this horrible thing to Zheng, they're not really in the story that much. I mean, their actions are referenced.
Their background.
And we should point out, this very much did happen historically.
Yes.
Like large numbers of particularly Korean women, but also Chinese women,
comfort women, they were
and
called.
Japanese and Taiwanese women were forced into slavery.
Sexual favors for the Japanese.
Sometimes hundreds of men a day.
Yeah,
it was quite horrific.
It was horrific. Yeah,
and so that horror is kind of like you put. It's in the background.
Yeah,
and what's so amazing is the way that the focus of the story seems to be on how the villagers are just complete jerks when Jinjin comes home, and how they mishandle her. And her one villager says she shouldn't have come back. It's too embarrassing to her father. And they're just complete a-holes.
Yeah, and this stems as well from an earlier strain of critique in the May 4th movement in 1919, which is that traditional thought is unacceptable. Like, it has no place in the modern world. And in a lot of ways in this story, that's sort of Dingling's ultimate, that's her ultimate example of this, is even women who have every need to be embraced and cared for by their community are in fact cast out because tradition finds them dirty and unacceptable.
I mean, that's the May 4th reading of the story, but I've got to wonder, is this story criticizing the traditional culture of the villages, or is it criticizing the communists who seem to be kind of AWOL? When the nameless narrator first comes to this village, she arrives in this village, and she goes to the Communist Party headquarters, and no one's there. No one's in the office. And that seems to be the whole thing about this story, is the Communist Party claims that it can make peasants into people who are good, modern citizens, but it's not doing anything.
Well, see, I think in this sense, I think you're letting your very, very strong hatred of anything communist sort of color your reading. Because
I don't know what you're talking about.
I know you don't. Because one way to read this is that the Communist Party is in fact the salvation of this girl, because she's leaving this horrible life behind to go to a place where the communists are going to save her and fix her. Not only physically, but mentally and spiritually as well. That's what she's hoping to do. And you could also say that had it not been for the party, the one person who understood her and cared for her, which is the narrator, would never have been there in the first place. So it's these things. They're sending people out there. But, I read the fact the Communist Party isn't present anywhere in the village as a matter of sort of, they can't be everywhere in the entire country. So.
But the party at this time that Dingling is writing this, the party claims that it's the peasants who are the salvation of China.
But there's a whole lot of peasants.
But still, that's I don't think that changes anything.
But your critique was that she went to the local office and no one was there, right? But that's the physical presence of the party. Right. They can't physically be in every single village in China.
I think you have a point, but I don't think it's very valid.
I think the reason I read it this way, I think, is because Dingling was fiercely critical of Mao and a lot of the stuff going at Yan'an, but she was not a hater of communism generally.
Absolutely. And she remained a socialist after this point. But what I will say, just historically, is that Dingling had the heck criticized out of her after this was published, and she had to sort of apologize to communists and say, oh, you're misinterpreting this. This isn't a criticism against communism, which of course means it is a criticism of communism, right? That she was just like faking it because she knew her head would be on a platter if she didn't say, oh, this actually wasn't a criticism of communism.
I'm curious why you think that.
Because that's what communist history is all about.
Well, but I mean that's a sort of an overly generalized gloss of a whole lot of things, like because Dingling was a communist sympathizer, so to say that she was secretly criticizing communism as an ideology.
I don't think it was very secretive. I think she was quite open in her criticism
of the CCP.
Of the CCP.
You're talking about communism as an ideology.
I'm sorry. I mean specifically the CCP.
Okay.
And the way it enacted leftist policies. She remained a leftist throughout her life.
Right.
And she believed in a lot of the ideals of the Communist Party, but she was disappointed by how it was implemented.
Right. It's interesting. There's one example in the story. There's a group of people in the village who are actually somewhat decent to Zhengzheng, and that's the young people in the village.
Right. The young communist.
The young communists, which there's your communist presence. The only people around who are decent are these people. The fact that they haven't completely uprooted traditional oppressive culture, it's not really much of a critique.
I think it definitely is.
You're saying that LIng is saying the Communist Party should have by then completely eradicated all notions of traditional thought.
I think what LIng is saying is that Mao is claiming that the salvation of the Chinese people is to be found within the peasantry. And then she's presenting the peasantry as being horrific to Zhengzheng. And so she's questioning whether or not that the peasantry should actually be the salvation.
Well, except that the young people are peasants too. And they're communist sympathizers and are taking care of her.
I don't know if the young people are peasants.
Well, they're in a peasant region. What else would they be doing?
I think the
Running
young people
factories
are actually are communist cadres.
Right, but they're pulled from the peasantry. They grew up on farms. They are the sons and daughters of peasants.
We're not told that in the story.
Right, but the fact, if the older people are all peasants, the only way you can say that is if all the young people never grew up on a farm and actually grew up in Yan'an instead, which of course they didn't.
My reading of the young people is that they're actually cadres from some other part of China.
So all the young people in the story are coming from somewhere else.
I think that the young people who you're specifically mentioning are coming from somewhere else.
See, I think you're extrapolating.
What's interesting, what I find so interesting is that Zhengzheng, although she's treated brutally by the Japanese, and this plays into my reading, Zhengzheng is treated brutally by the Japanese, but she still seems to admire the Japanese. There's a point where she asks the nameless narrator, I hear that women in the south of China can read, just like the Japanese women. And what Zhengzheng really wants is to be able to read, to go get this education. And she's actually looking up to the Japanese in terms of how great they are. And she's dismissing the traditional North Chinese repressive culture.
Which I think that is the point at which the CCP would have lost their minds, because anyone knows that a good Chinese writer, they're at this period, their MO is to shred the Japanese at any turn. Well, in this story, that happens. It also doesn't happen. There's a lot of complexity in this view of the Japanese, and even the narrator doesn't seem to propound any firm views on the Japanese. And I find
the narrator. So the word Jap devil is used throughout the story. And it's very nasty in Chinese, just as it is in English. But what's interesting is the narrator never uses that word. She never says anything.
Right. Mm-hmm. And, the fact that Lee and I are arguing over how to read the story is one of the reasons why it's such a great story. I mean,
it's easy to read it in multiple ways.
And not in the sort of, I'm a literary student that way, so I choose to read this in weird ways. Like, you are not told, LIng withholds information from you at seemingly every turn.
So much of the story is about not hearing things correctly and not knowing what's going on. That's what I find so fascinating.
And LIng, among many other things, was a profoundly effective feminist writer in the sense that she put into print things that Chinese women were struggling with that no one else had ever done. And in this story especially, one of the reasons it's kind of hard to figure out what to do with it is because she's not going to toe any specific line for you. She's not going to serve the Japanese heads up on a platter. That's not going to happen. She's not going to bring in communist heroes. That's not going to happen. Or peasant heroes, or villains even. Some of the people in the village are villains, but there's a lot of others who are not. There are people in between. It's an immensely complex portrait, and I think that's one of the reasons why A, the CCP would have hated it, and B, why we're still reading it.
Yeah. I want to ask you before we finish up. So the nameless narrator forms this very profoundly close relationship with Zhengzheng very quickly. And she's very sympathetic to Zhengzhen's travails that she goes through after her rape. Do you think that the narrator was raped?
I don't know. That's a good question. Again, there's elements of Miss Sophie's Diary in earlier work where things like this are hinted at very subtly, but you can't ever really know. And it would certainly explain they form a connection very quickly. In the story, it's a matter of like 3 sentences. First they meet, then they become like best friends forever. And that would certainly explain a lot of it. And it also explained why they don't talk about any details. The narrator herself says she knows that that Zheng is hiding something, but she doesn't want to ask her about it. She doesn't have the place.
At the beginning of the story, it's mentioned that the narrator left on kind of a vacation almost from Yan'an to relax. And I kind of wonder if the reason that she left was actually because she's struggling with sexual assault.
Yeah, and I think, based on her very vehement critique of the way women were treated by the CCP, especially in Yan'an, that's probably not out of bounds.
Yeah.
I had one of my final little thoughts here is when I was a master's student at Nankai, one of our professors, and only one, took great delight in sort of picking apart what students were taught in school about sort of the communist legacy. When he was talking about Yan'an, some of his fiercest comments were exactly on this. He said, you were taught that women were treated equally with everyone else and had a place in the party in Yan'an, and that's absolutely not true. Sexual assault was rampant. Women were not allowed to speak the same way men were, and things of that nature. We have a different podcast on Mao's talks at Yan'an, and he's taking, among others, LIng to task, partly for stories like this, for suggesting that, it's great that you're doing this, but things are a lot more complicated than you think. Yeah, exactly.
I think one of the great things about this story is so much of it is about what's not said and trying to read between the lines. And, the listener should definitely pick up a copy.
Yes.
When I Was in Sha Village by LIng. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.